All right, good morning, everybody. This is the Shad and River Herring Management Board. My name is Lynn Fagley. I'm an administrative proxy from the state of Maryland, and I am the vice chair of this board. I'm sitting in for Justin Davis, who could not attend today. And I ask your forbearance. There are some new faces around the table that I just don't know, so if I struggle a little bit to call out names, just bear with me. So with that, the first order of business is approval of the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? Okay, we'll call the agenda approved by consent. And next, you have the proceedings from the October 2021 meeting in your packet. Are there any additions or changes to those proceedings? Okay, we'll call the proceedings approved by consent. And next, we will move to public comment. Do I have any comment from the public? Okay, so with that, and I will just preface this, that we'll be looking for a motion at the conclusion of this. We are going to be looking to consider American shad habitat plans. There is an update from Connecticut and a new plan from the Merrimack River. So with that, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Wes Aiken, sorry Wes if I didn't get that right, to walk us through those two plans. Thank you.
No problem. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, great. So are you just going to advance the slides for me then? Okay. Thank you. And thanks everyone. My name is Wes Aiken. I'm with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. I'm currently the vice chair of the Shad and River Herring TC, and like Lynn, I'm also filling in for our current chair, Brian Nealon, who was unavailable today. So there's three things that for your consideration today. As Lynn said, the shad habitat plans. We have a couple of state Sfmps, and then a prioritization or passage prioritization task. I will, for the sake of time, give the presentation for the habitat plans and the state Sfmps together, and then pause for questions before moving on to the last item. So a little background on the shad habitat plans. Under Amendment 3, all states and jurisdictions are required to submit habitat plans, which are meant to contain a summary of information on current and historical spawning habitats, nursery habitats, and threats to those habitats, as well as habitat restoration programs that are occurring within each state. In February 2020, the board agreed that these plans should be updated every 5 years, similar to the Sfmps, and asked states to update their existing plans that were originally approved in 2014, and for states with missing plans to submit a new habitat plan. And since then, the board has approved 15 plans and updates from the states listed below. Next slide, please. So last month, the TC reviewed, I guess it was in April, a few months ago. Or no, it was last month. Anyways, last month, the TC reviewed a plan update for the Connecticut River and a new plan for the Merrimack. And after the plan, reviewing the plans, the TC recommended the approval of both of the submitted plans with some minor recommendations for some changes and inclusions. Next slide, please. So the first plan for consideration is the Connecticut River Habitat Plan update. This was submitted by the Connecticut River Atlantic Salmon Commission. Next slide, please. So this plan was an update from the 2021 report. And it's a FERC comprehensive plan. It's a habitat-based, it takes habitat-based production units by river segment and a minimum adult annual population targets. It also defines past performance metrics, and both of the above mentioned, like I said, have been accepted by FERC as a comprehensive plan. They identified threats for fish passage, hydropower, and invasive hydrilla expansion. The TC recommended minor formatting changes and noted for future versions to consider requiring states to report more specific water quality parameters that cause degradation. I think it's also important to note here that the FERC, having a FERC comprehensive plan gives, it has a little bit of teeth to it. So the TC recognizes that, and it's recommending that states, if possible, have their habitat plans approved by FERC as a comprehensive plan. Next slide, please. The next habitat plan is from the Merrimack River. That was submitted by the Merrimack River Naturalist Program. Next slide. The habitat assessment, American shad currently have access to 38% of the historical main stem habitat and major tribs from the mouth up to the Garvin Falls hydroelectric facility. In the accessible reaches, passage inefficiencies due to poor facility design or seasonal flow regimes limit restoration goals and improvements must be made through the FERC process and engagement with dam owners. Next slide, please. They listed a few threats here. The plan identifies those threats as barriers to upstream and downstream migration, hydropower, anthropogenic habitat changes, and climate change. Next slide, please. Within the Merrimack system, there have been significant and ongoing habitat restoration efforts to understand and reduce the impacts of threats to American shad and shad spawning and nursery habitats identified in the plan. The recent restoration efforts include targeting of several dams for removal or passage installation. Since 2009, the MRTC has maintained an active hatchery supplementation program, as well as truck and transfer of gravid fish upriver. They've coordinated water quality monitoring on the main stem and tributaries, and the respective state agencies, federal agencies, nonprofits, and power companies and others. The TC recommended including language to define the passage standards that Massachusetts is using, which is an upstream passage efficiency of 80%. Next slide, please. So moving into the Shad River Herring Sfmp plan updates. Next slide. So Amendment 2 and 3 of the FMP require states wishing to have a fishery to submit a sustainable fisheries management plan that will demonstrate that their stock can support a commercial and/or recreational fishery that will not diminish the future of stock reproduction and recruitment. These plans are updated and reviewed every 5 years to reassess stock status and sustainability. Next slide, please. So last month, the TC reviewed plans for shad in the Delaware River Basin and river herring in the Hudson River. After reviewing the plans, the TC recommends approval of both the plans as submitted. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the Delaware Basin American shad Sfmp update. This was submitted by the Delaware River Basin and Wildlife Management Cooperative. The updated plan proposes a new female mortality benchmark and more conservative thresholds and triggers relative to the current triggers to the current metrics already in use. Proposed changes to management include the implementation of the commercial harvest quota for the state of New Jersey and Delaware, representing a 33% reduction from the most recent 10-year average, excluding the anomalous 2014 harvest. The other management option is the reduction in commercial creel limit from 3 fish down to 2 fish. And these new metrics were developed in response to the most recent benchmark stock assessment, which indicated that there was unsustainable female adult mortality for the Delaware stock. Next slide, please. So for future potential management actions, if one or more of the benchmarks are exceeded, the co-op will implement management actions commensurate with the benchmark exceedance. So some options for the commercial fishery would be gear area, seasonal restrictions, escapement periods, trip limits, quota with an in-season closure in Delaware, reduced quota in Delaware and New Jersey. Also, an option is the closure of the commercial fishery, and other measures that could be determined later. On the rec side of things, creel limit reductions to 1 fish per day, go to recreational catch and release only, seasonal area and gear closures or restrictions. And there's always the option of the closure of the recreational fishery and other measures to be determined. Next slide, please. So for the Hudson River herring SFMP update, so stock status, mortality estimates have either remained stable or decreasing, and they're below a new sustainability target. Mean length and mean length at age have been either increasing or stable. Frequency of repeat spawning has been increasing, and our YY index has been erratic, but we have not experienced any recruitment failure. So the new sustainability threshold that's being proposed is based on adult female total mortality using a Z40 threshold, similar to what was done in the recent Shad stock assessment. And those resulting thresholds for female alewives is a Z of 1.26 and 1.19 for bluebacks. This is in addition to the already in use YY index, commercial CPV, repeat spawning, mean length at age, benchmarks or metrics in the previous plans. The Hudson River is requesting status quo based on the regulations that were in place in 2013 with continuation of a restricted fishery in the Hudson, no nets and tributaries, gear mesh and area restrictions, 36-hour escapement period for all commercial gears, continuation of our recreational possession limit of 10 fish per person, and a moratorium in all other state waters. Proposed management actions, New York will take immediate management action following recruitment failure or unsustainable adult female mortality, and potential management actions may include but not limited to gear restrictions, area restrictions, and permanent system restructuring. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll pause if anyone has any questions on the habitat plans or the SFMPs.
Great. Thank you, Wes, and really nice job getting through those in a very concise way. So does anybody have any questions for Wes, either about the habitat plan for shad or the sustainable fishery management plans? Any questions? Bill Hyatt.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, just a quick question. And I might have missed something. The Delaware plan was made necessary because there's identified as a basically the stock was identified as unsustainable in the 2020 stock assessment benchmark, and there were a couple of other stocks that were similarly identified in that benchmark. I think the Connecticut River and the Potomac. My question has to do with what is the time frame required for responding to that unsustainable determination? So I guess it's from the 2020 stock assessment. Delaware is doing so now. I think there's a couple that still have to be addressed, and I'm just wondering what the time frame requirement might be, if there is one. Thank you.
Yeah, I can take a shot at that, but Caitlin or James, feel free to jump in. But my understanding is there was no requirement to respond to the results of the stock assessment. But yeah, Caitlin, if you want to correct me if I'm wrong.
That's correct. There's no requirement.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think what I'd like to do here, are there any other questions about these two items? Okay, so we're going to need a motion, and I think what I'd like to do is do two separate motions, one for habitat and one for sustainable management plans. So Dr. Rhodes, I'll start with you.
All right, well, I would move to approve and accept the American shad habitat plans for the Connecticut and Merrimack rivers.
Terrific, thank you, Malcolm Rhodes. And Jim Gilmore, is that a second? Excellent, okay. Is there any discussion on this motion? Okay, I'm going to read it into the record and call the question. The motion is to move to approve and accept the American shad habitat plans from Connecticut and Massachusetts as presented today. Motion by Dr. Rhodes, second by Mr. Gilmore. Is there any opposition to this motion? Okay, we'll consider it approved by consent. Thank you very much. And then I'll be looking for a motion for the sustainability plans. Martin Gary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would move to consider the American shad and river herring sustainable fishery management plans for New York for river herring and for the Delaware River Basin Cooperative for American shad.
Excellent. Is there a second? Joe Cimino, I think. All right. Is there any discussion on this motion? All right. I'll read it into the record. The motion is move to approve the shad and sustainable fishery management plan for the Delaware Basin Co-op and the river herring sustainable fishery management plan from New York as presented today. Motion by Mr. Gary, second by Mr. Cimino. Is there any opposition to this motion? Excellent. Okay, we'll consider that approved by consent. And the next item on the agenda is to look at the task that the board presented to the TC, which was to prioritize systems for shad recovery and develop that inventory of data. So I think we're going back to Wes for that.
Thank you. So a little background on this task. So following the 2020 stock assessment, in which they examined fish passage performance and its effects on shad production potential, they used standardized data and simulation modeling and determined that the overall dams completely or partially blocked nearly 40% of the historical American shad habitat. So in May of 2021, at the TC's recommendation, the board tasked the TC with prioritizing systems for shad recovery and developing an inventory of available data that would support development of fish passage criteria. Next slide, please. So in response to that task, the TC formed a task group to develop information and draft recommendations for TC review. The steps taken in development of the task, a query of FERC projects currently or soon to be relicensed in the next decade. U.S. Fish and Wildlife and NOAA have Section 18 Fish Passage Prescription Authority, which is a legal tool to have FERC direct hydro project owners to implement and evaluate passage and protection measures. As a result of that, a total of 158 FERC projects were identified from Maine to Florida, based only on the FERC license status and schedule. Next slide, please. So the TC members from each state were then asked to decide whether a project in their state was a priority based on the following criteria: whether they have an existing recovery plan, have performance standards, upstream passage, downstream passage, is Holocene passage needed, and is the system a state priority? So ultimately, the TC developed a list of 34 priority FERC licensed projects based on the above criteria. And I apologize, I don't think the tables coming up were included in the briefing material. Next slide, please. So for each priority project, the TC recommends that the relevant state and federal agencies determine the extent to which their existing restoration or management plans are current and relevant for information to best address upstream and downstream passage, specific to their goals and or objectives. This includes considering the following, which if an existing plan information doesn't suitably address fish passage, the plan should be updated with state and federal participation with staff familiar with both Section 18 authorities and water quality certifications. Specific passage performance criteria should be discussed and developed by agencies. Criteria should rely on a diverse set of information for supporting the rationale, including but not limited to the plans and goal, or the plan goals and objectives. Performance targets should address rates of passage success that include percent passage success for fish arriving at a project area, a time component to address delay as part of passage success, and survival rates with project passage. As I alluded to or mentioned earlier, a plan should be submitted to FERC for status as comprehensive management plans, requiring FERC licensees to address these plans. Next slide, please. So this is the table of the summarized FERC projects by state with the questionnaire responses. As you can see, we ended up with a total of 34. Next slide, please. And this just takes that same, there's 34 priority projects and identifies the river systems that they're located in and how many projects per river system. Next slide. And I'll be glad to take any questions on this as well.
Great, thank you, Wes. Are there any questions on this for Wes? Any online? Okay, Wes, I had one for you. I was very interested when I read the Merrimack plan, or maybe it's for Massachusetts or New Hampshire, that there's 7 dams in the Merrimack that would, if there's projects implemented, would double access to spawning area. And I wonder, are those 7 dams included on this prioritization?
That is a good question. I am not sure. I was not part of this task group, but Caitlin was more involved than myself. She might be better able to answer that.
It was a curiosity question. It was yeah, thank you.
They have listed 3 as priority projects. I would assume that they would be.
Yeah, okay. Well, in the interest of time, we'll move on. So I think the next step is, Caitlin, we need to have possible action to approve the prioritization. Is that what we're doing?
Thanks, Ms. Chair. So the board can take an action if it wishes, but I don't believe any action is needed. Essentially, the presentation of this is the final product of the task that the board asked for. The table that you see here is not the only product. There is an extensive Excel spreadsheet that we will send out to the board, and that contains all of the information on each of those river systems, what the TC identified as needed in those systems, and what data are available for the development of passage standards. So the idea is for the states to be able to take that information and use it when they're looking at their own passage improvements, I guess, across the coast.
Excellent. Thank you, Caitlin. So in the interest of time, we'll move on. We'll assume, since there's no questions and it doesn't appear to be any objections, we'll accept. Oh, Bill Hyatt. Sorry, apologies. Go ahead.
Thank you. I almost forgot I had my hand up. Yeah, I just had a real quick question, and that's just curiosity as to why the prioritization effort was limited to FERC projects alone. And part of the reason I'm asking is I know that there is a high priority project on a large dam facility that isn't FERC regulated as part of the Connecticut River Basin. So just a general question as to why this prioritization effort was limited exclusively to FERC projects.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not for sure. I'm gonna assume that this was a low-hanging fruit, that we were able to access the FERC database. But Caitlin, if you have any other insight.
Yeah, thanks, Wes. Beyond that, it is lower hanging fruit. The TC thought it was appropriate to focus on these FERC projects because they are coming up for relicensing in the next 10 years or so. And those relicensing periods provide a really good opportunity to add some requirements to those projects to improve fish passage for shad and river herring. So that's why the TC focused on FERC projects in this case.
If I can follow up, Lynn, I'll just add, I totally understand that. Just point out that sometimes prioritization lists are used in the process of awarding grant monies and making decisions, and just that recognizing that compiling a FERC list is easiest and obviously covers almost all of the priorities, that there might be some that priority projects that might want to be considered that don't fall under the FERC umbrella. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I think that is well noted for the record. So unless there's any objection. Oh, and Roy Miller has a question, followed by Chris Wright.
Thank you, Lynn. Just a quick follow-up to Bill Hyatt's question. I noticed the absence of any New Jersey, Delaware listing there. Can I assume is this the total list of FERC projects, or is it an incomplete list? Specifically, I guess the dams on the Lehigh and the Schuylkill on the Delaware Basin are not FERC projects, hence they're missing from this list. Is that correct, that this is the totality of FERC projects?
No, this is the select, sorry, Wes, number of FERC projects that the TC identified as priorities through the process that Wes described in his presentation. So there was an original list that was much larger.
Okay. Thank you.
Chris Wright, you're up.
Oh, I just wanted to, we at NOAA Fisheries wanted to thank the TC for the report, and this will be a valuable resource for FERC relicensing negotiations and other inputs. But we just wanted to thank this TC for the report and their work on this effort, and it's going to help us a lot in the future. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? So I think right now what we're going to do is we're going to move forward with this prioritization list. Oh, and we've got, wait for it, Alan Weaver, you're up.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. Yeah, I just joined about 10 minutes ago. So for Virginia, I'm the fish patch coordinator for Virginia. I see Appomattox. We also have Emporia Dam on the Meherrin River in Virginia. You know, it has shad and herring that actually we know shad and herring get to that site. That site has a lot of issues. The fishway on the Appomattox at Brassfield Dam is certainly operational. It hasn't really been put to the test that much yet because we just opened up, downriver some dams, and, we don't know if target fish are getting there yet, but we know target fish are getting to the Emporia Dam, and I'm just wondering how the Emporia Dam project did not make this list, I guess is my question.
Wes, I can try to take this one since you weren't involved in this task group, but if you did not see the beginning of the presentation, that might have explained it.
Okay.
I have a large list of projects. This will be sent out to the states. You can review that list when we send it out and let us know. I don't know if Emporia Dam is FERC and whether it's coming up for relicensing, but that affected the list of 34 that the TC prioritized.
Okay. Yes, I mean it's a priority for NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, us, DWR. I mean, it's a priority for fish passage. I just, I don't know how this list affects, what FERC's going to do about that site. But anyway, okay. Yeah, if there's another list that'll, if there's more information that'll be coming, I'll wait to look at that. I just wanted to mention the Emporia site.
Okay, thank you. So I think what we're going to do is this list is going to be distributed. We have a stock assessment underway. I think what we're recognizing is that there are non-FERC dams that are not on this list. We have that noted for the record. I think this group's going to be very busy with this upcoming stock assessment, but what we may want to do is go back around, and once that stock assessment is completed and we see the results of that, we may want to think again about maybe taking a deeper look at some of these non-FERC dams. So if that's acceptable to the board, I think we'll go ahead and move forward. Does anybody have any more comments on this? Okay, good. All right, so with that, the next item on the agenda is Fishery Management Plan Review and Compliance, and I think for that we're going over to James Boyle.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. I'll just wait for my, here it is, okay. All right, so as mentioned, I'm going to be going through the Shad and River Herring Sfmp review for the fishing year of 2020. Next slide, please. As a quick overview of the presentation, I'm going to start with a short reminder of historical landings over time and then get into the 2020 fishing year specifically. And then next, I will move on to some of the monitoring and the compliance reports, including fish passage, stocking efforts, and sturgeon bycatch interactions. Finally, I'll end with the de minimis requests and the report and recommendations from the plan review team. Next slide, please. So just a quick reminder of the historical context. This figure shows the trajectories of commercial landings for river herring and American shad since 1950. Starting in the 1970s, river herring landings fell drastically and then steadily decreased over time. For shad, there's also been a steady decrease in landings over time, which is, of course, in part due to the moratoria implemented through Amendments 2 and 3. Next slide, please. So it's difficult to see what's going on at the end of that time series in the first figure. So this is a zoom in of landings since 1990, where there's a little more variation for river herring, with landings increasing from 2016 to 2019 until decreasing a little bit in 2020. And for shad, you see a general downward trend in landings since the 1990s. Next slide, please. So moving on to 2020, this table shows state landings and coastwide totals for commercial shad and river herring, excluding confidential data. For river herring, coastwide commercial landings, including bycatch, totaled just over 2 million pounds, which is a 36% decrease from the 2019 landings. Some of you may notice that the numbers here are slightly different than in the draft Sfmp report. Since drafting the document, I did some digging into the dramatically reduced bycatch landings for river herring and found additional landings to include in this column. So this number of 167,445 pounds is the latest updated number. That's still a significant reduction in bycatch of 77% from 2019, which is almost entirely attributable to lower bycatch reported in Massachusetts. Although it is important to note that as of the 2020 fishing year, Massachusetts eliminated their state port-size sampling program, only reporting NOAA Northeast Fishery Observer Program, or NEFOP, data, so what it's worth. For American shad, the total 2020 commercial landings, directed and bycatch, reported in compliance reports was 407,179 pounds, which is a 49% increase from landings in 2019. However, bycatch landings of shad are down 24%. Reported hickory shad commercial landings was 92,023 pounds, which is a 36% decrease from 2019. I will note that the directed and bycatch totals are both confidential, as individually they don't satisfy the rule of 3, but the sum of both is the correct number. So the 92,000 is accurate. Next slide, please. So as part of the requirements in Amendments 2 and 3 for river herring and shad, passage counts are required on select rivers in Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and South Carolina. 6.25 million counted river herring represents a 4.4% decrease compared to 2019, and 713,520 shad is a 63% increase compared to 2019. Although it is important to note, as will come up again later, that many states could not complete all of their monitoring requirements due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So for passage, monitoring for river herring in the Androscoggin River in Maine and the Schuylkill River in Pennsylvania was not able to be completed, and as well as 3 locations on the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware could also not complete their monitoring for both shad and river herring. Next slide, please. During 2020, hatchery-reared American shad fry were stocked in the Pawcatucket River in Rhode Island and the Santee River in South Carolina, totaling 14.7 million American shad. That's a 22% increase from 2019. Maine also continues to participate in trap and transfer stocking of adult pre-spawning alewife of wild origin on the Androscoggin River. And so in the report, we're only talking about nursery hatched fry, so not wild caught fish. Next slide, please. For sturgeon interactions in 2020, there were 73 reported interactions with 0 fatalities, although there is a note to that New Jersey gill netters report the weight of discarded sturgeon, not individuals. And so they reported 2,921 pounds. Of those 73 interactions, 39 were identified as Atlantic sturgeon, 5 as short nose, and 29 were unclassified. Rhode Island, as a quick note, reports NOAA NEFOP and at-sea monitoring data, which is available after the compliance report submission deadline. Therefore, their data lags by 1 year. So for the 2020 fishing year, Rhode Island reported 9 interactions from 2019. And then we'll see the 2020 interactions in this year's compliance report in July. Next slide, please. For the upcoming fishing year, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Florida have requested de minimis status for their shad fisheries, and New Hampshire, Georgia, and Florida request de minimis status for river herring. They have all met the requirements and qualify for de minimis status based on their commercial landings being less than 1% of coastwide landings. Next slide, please. So in evaluating the state compliance reports, the PRT did note some inconsistencies with requirements in Amendments 2 and 3. The only issue that seemed worthy of note is the monitoring that was not completed due to the pandemic. A full description of the missing monitoring can be found in Table 6 of the Sfmp report, so we have like an inventory of everything that was missed. There were some other small inconsistencies with the new compliance report template. That this is only the second, I think, time it's been used, but it's working very well. Such as not including some sections, even if just to say not applicable, but we'll work with the states to correct these in future reports. It again didn't rise to the level of concern for the PRT. So with those minor issues, and given the circumstances regarding the monitoring, the PRT did not feel that it should be held against the states and recommended approval for the compliance reports for 2020. The PRT did have one recommendation, which is to move Section 8B, which provides the results of hickory shad monitoring to the appendices. This change would allow states that conduct hickory shad monitoring a place to share the results while removing optional data from the main body of the compliance report, thereby further streamlining the compliance review process with this new format. Next slide, please. So with that information, the action for the board is to consider approval of the 2020 Shad and River Herring F&P review, the state compliance reports, and de minimis status for Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Georgia, and Florida. Next slide, please. Are there any questions? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, James. Okay, any questions from the board? Allison Colden, you're up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, James, for that presentation. So I noted when you mentioned earlier that the river herring bycatch numbers had been adjusted, but also that the portside monitoring program in Massachusetts had ended and they were only reporting the fishery observer data. Do you have any indication or context on how the observer program may have been impacted by COVID in terms of numbers of days lost in the observer program or any other information?
I don't have any of that context, but I can look into that, but I'm not sure if anybody else has any knowledge of that from NOAA.
Doesn't look, Allison, like anybody around the table can offer additional information on that. It's noted on the record, and if some information can be turned up, we can certainly forward that to you. Are there any other questions on FMP review and state compliance? Okay, so I'll be looking for a motion to approve these, and I have Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would move to approve the Fisheries Management Plan review, state compliance reports, and de minimis requests for Maine, New Hampshire, Mass, and Florida for American shad, and New Hampshire, Georgia, and Florida for river herring for the 2020 fishing year.
And I have Doug Haymans, I believe, for a second. Okay, I will read it into the record. Move to approve Fishery Management Plan review, state compliance reports, and de minimis requests for Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Florida for American shad, and New Hampshire, Georgia, and Florida for river herring for the 2020 fishing year. Motion by Mr. Kelleher, second by Mr. Haymans. Is there any discussion on the motion? Okay, is there any opposition to the motion? That's brilliant. We are moving on to our next agenda item, which is going to be Dr. Katie Drew is going to lead us through an update on the 2023 River Herring Benchmark Stock Assessment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So basically, we have a benchmark scheduled. The terminal end result of the assessment will be presented to the board at the annual meeting in 2023, so about a year and a half from now. This is the current timeline. You can see the data submission deadline is going to be July 1st, 2022, and followed by a data workshop, which will be virtual, July 12th through the 14th. We have then a methods workshop and an assessment workshop to be followed after that to have a peer review in August of 2023. So this is the current broad timeline. This will be an ASMFC external peer review. So there is a little bit of flexibility in this timeline if things become difficult. But this is kind of what we're shooting for right now. Next slide. The main component that we're sort of updating you about and we'd like some feedback on is basically we are requesting nominations for the Stock Assessment Subcommittee at this point. So the deadline for that is May 20th. And we are, as a reminder, looking for expertise in river herring biology and stock assessment, especially data poor methods for this species complex. So I believe the call for nominations was sent to the administrative commissioners earlier or at the end of last month, and the deadline will be coming up soon for that. So I'm happy to take any questions on the stock assessment process.
Thank you very much, Katie. Are there any questions on the stock assessment? Jason McNamee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hey, Katie. Wondering what you guys are thinking about, the potential for those missing data elements, if you guys are thinking ahead of that a little bit, what you might do there.
So I think this is going to be one of our throw everything at the wall and see what sticks assessments. So obviously this is a data limited stock, and we have a lot of we have limited data that's different from river to river, so we have to be kind of creative in terms of what we're doing. So I think we'll follow the Shad assessment in a lot of the things that they sort of moved the ball forward with for these species. But I think it's going to be hard to figure out the exact details until we see all of the data in front of us and figure out what we have and what we don't have.
Great, thank you. Any other questions about the upcoming benchmark? Okay, that's great. So we have one final item of business, and that is to review and populate the advisory panel membership, and we are going to send it over to Tina Berger for that.
One second, Madam Chair.
You got it.
Thank you. I offer for your consideration and approval a new nomination from Maine, Deborah Wilson, who has been involved in Maine fisheries and fisheries management for over 40 years. Her nomination form and information was provided in the Maine meeting materials. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. And I'm looking at a hand raise from Marty Gary.
Madam Chair, just move to approve that nomination.
Okay, and I have a second from Pat Kelleher. Is there any discussion on this motion? I think she's going to be a great asset to this group. Okay, I will read the motion into the record then. The motion is to approve the nomination of Deborah Wilson from Maine to the Shad and River Herring Advisory Panel. I had a motion by Martin Gary, second by Pat Kelleher. Okay, is there any opposition? Great, we are approved by consent. And at the very last order, I'll ask, is there any opposition to adjourning this meeting? Okay, we stand adjourned. Well done.